In the harsh wilderness of the American frontier, where legends walked among men and ancient powers still held sway over the land, a solitary cowboy made a choice that would forever alter his destiny. What began as a simple act of mercy rescuing a young indigenous girl from certain death transformed into an encounter with forces beyond human comprehension. For the girl he saved was no ordinary child. She was the daughter of a giant, a being of myth and terror whose shadow stretched across mountains. This is a story of courage, mystery, and the thin line between humanity and legend. The sun hung low over the Dakota Badlands, painting the rocky terrain in shades of amber and crimson. Jack Morrison had been riding alone for 3 days, his horse's hooves kicking up dust that settled on his weathered coat like a second skin. He was a man of few words and fewer connections, having spent the better part of his 40 years drifting from one forgotten corner of the frontier to another. The Civil War had taken his family, his farm, and whatever dreams he'd once harbored about settling down. Now he was just another shadow moving across an endless landscape, carrying nothing but a rifle, a worn saddlebag, and memories he'd rather forget. The terrain grew rougher as he followed a dried riverbed through a canyon carved by centuries of water and wind. Towering rock formations rose on either side like silent sentinels, their surfaces marked with ancient petroglyphs that spoke of peoples who had walked this land long before white settlers arrived. Jack had learned to read some of these signs during his years of wandering warnings about territorial boundaries, sacred grounds, and places where the spirits were said to be restless. It was near dusk when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind whistling through the rocks. But Jack had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and something about that sound made him rein in his horse and listen. There it was again, clearer this time, a human voice, weak and desperate, calling out in a language he didn't understand. He dismounted and followed the sound to a narrow ravine where the earth had split open like a wound. At the bottom, perhaps 20 feet down, lay a young girl of no more than 12 or 13 years. She wore traditional indigenous clothing, a deerskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork, and her long black hair was matted with dirt and blood. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and she looked up at him with eyes that held both fear and hope. Jack didn't hesitate. He'd seen enough suffering in his life to know that hesitation meant death. He secured his rope to a sturdy boulder and descended into the ravine, his boots finding purchase on the rocky slope. The girl watched him approach, her breath coming in short, pained gasps. When he reached her, he spoke in the few words of Lakota he'd picked up over the years, trying to communicate that he meant no harm. She responded in a dialect he couldn't quite place, but her meaning was clear enough. She'd been running from something or someone and had fallen into this ravine while fleeing through the darkness. Jack carefully examined her leg, noting the clean break and the swelling that had already begun. Without proper setting, she'd likely lose the limb to infection within days. Working quickly, he fashioned a splint from branches and strips of his own shirt, binding her leg as gently as possible while she bit down on a leather strap to keep from crying out. Then came the harder part, getting her out of the ravine. She was lighter than he expected, almost unnaturally so, and he was able to lift her without much difficulty. Using the rope and his own strength, he slowly hauled both of them back to level ground as the last light faded from the sky. Jack made camp in a sheltered alcove between two massive boulders, building a small fire that would be hidden from view by the surrounding rocks. He gave the girl water from his canteen and a portion of his dried meat, which she accepted with trembling hands. As she ate, he noticed something unusual about her appearance. Her eyes were a striking shade of amber, almost glowing in the firelight, and her features, while clearly indigenous, had an otherworldly quality he couldn't quite define. She spoke again, more urgently this time, gesturing toward the darkening canyon beyond their shelter. Jack understood enough to know she was warning him about something, Her words tumbled out in a rush, mixing what sounded like Lakota with something older, more primal. She kept pointing toward the mountains to the north, where the peaks disappeared into low-hanging clouds, and making a gesture with her hands that suggested something enormous. Jack tried to calm her, speaking in a low, steady voice while adding more wood to the fire. Whatever she was afraid of, they were safer here than stumbling through the Badlands in darkness with her injured leg. He'd dealt with hostile tribes before, with outlaws and wild animals, and he figured he could handle whatever the morning might bring. He spread out his bedroll and indicated that she should rest, then settled himself against the rock wall with his rifle across his lap, ready to keep watch through the night. The girl eventually fell into an uneasy sleep, occasionally crying out in her dreams. Jack sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the wilderness around them, the distant howl of wolves, the rustle of wind through sage, the crack and pop of the cooling fire. He found himself wondering about this child, about where she'd come from and what she'd been running from. There was something about her that didn't fit the normal pattern of things, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with the cold night air. As the moon rose above the canyon rim, casting silver light across the Badlands, Jack Morrison had no way of knowing that his simple act of mercy had set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he understood about the world and his place in it. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Badlands, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Jack had dozed fitfully through the night, waking at every unfamiliar sound, but nothing had disturbed their camp. The girl stirred as the first rays of sunlight reached their shelter, and he saw her eyes snap open with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. She tried to sit up and immediately gasped in pain as her broken leg reminded her of its condition. Jack moved to help her, offering water and more of his meager food supplies. In the daylight, he could see that her injuries were more extensive than he'd realized. Bruises covered her arms and shoulders, and there was a deep cut along her jaw that would need cleaning to prevent infection. As he tended to her wounds, she began to speak more calmly, still in that strange dialect he couldn't fully understand. But through gestures and the few words they shared in common, a story began to emerge. Her name was something that sounded like Aida, first to dance, and she came from a tribe that lived in the high mountains to the north, in territories that few white men had ever penetrated. She had been sent on some kind of mission, though Jack couldn't make out the details. What was clear was that she needed to return to her people urgently, and that time was critical. She kept touching a small leather pouch that hung around her neck, decorated with symbols that hurt Jack's eyes to look at too. Directly, they seemed to shift and change in the morning light, never quite holding the same form. Jack explained through signs that they couldn't travel until her leg had time to heal, at least a few days to ensure the bone was setting properly. The girl became agitated at this, shaking her head vigorously and pointing again toward the northern mountains. She tried to stand, determined to continue her journey despite the obvious impossibility, and Jack had to gently but firmly hold her down. That S, when he heard it, a sound like nothing he'd ever encountered in all his years on the frontier. It started as a low vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself, making small pebbles dance on the ground. Then it grew into a rhythmic pounding, like massive footsteps, each one making the canyon wall shudder. Jack's horse, tethered nearby, began to panic, pulling against its rope and whinnying in terror. The girl's face went pale, and she clutched Jack's arm with surprising strength, speaking rapidly in her language. The fear in her voice was unmistakable. Jack grabbed his rifle and moved to the edge of their shelter, scanning the canyon for the source of the sound. What he saw made his blood run cold. Moving through the canyon, perhaps a quarter-mile away, was a figure that defied all reason and logic. It stood at least 30 feet tall, with massive limbs like tree trunks and a body that seemed carved from living stone. Its skin had the texture and color of weathered granite, and its face, though vaguely human, possessed features that suggested something far older and more primordial than any tribe that currently walked the earth. The giant, for what else could it be called, moved with surprising grace for something so enormous, each step covering distances that would take a man a dozen strides. It was searching for something, its massive head turning from side to side as it scanned the terrain. In one hand, it carried what looked like an entire tree trunk, used as a walking staff or perhaps a weapon. Jack pressed himself against the rock wall, pulling the girl deeper into the shadows of their alcove. His mind raced, trying to reconcile what his eyes were seeing with everything he'd believed about the world. Giants were the stuff of fairy tales and campfire stories, not real things that walked under the same sun that had risen that morning. The giant paused, and Jack could have sworn it sniffed the air like a hound seeking a scent. Then it threw back its head and released a roar that echoed through the canyon like thunder, causing rocks to tumble from the cliff faces. The sound was filled with rage and desperation, and something else, an almost human anguish that cut through Jack's terror and touched something deeper. Next to him, the girl was weeping silently, tears streaming down her face as she watched the giant's progress. She whispered a single word over and over, and though Jack didn't know the language, he suddenly understood its meaning with terrible clarity. "Father." The giant continued its search for another hour, moving through the canyon with increasing agitation. Several times it came within 100 yards of their hiding place, and Jack held his breath, knowing that his rifle would be useless against such a creature. But each time, something caused the giant to veer away, following some trail that Jack couldn't perceive. Finally, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the giant released another earth-shaking roar and strode away toward the east, each step taking it farther from their position. The ground continued to tremble for several minutes after it disappeared from view, and Jack's horse didn't calm down for a full hour after that. When Jack finally found his voice, he turned to the girl with questions burning in his eyes. She met his gaze with those strange amber eyes and began to speak, more slowly this time, as if trying to make him understand. Through gestures and drawings scratched in the dirt, she told him a story that seemed to come from the beginning of the world itself. She was indeed the giant's daughter, born of a union between the Ancient One's beings who had walked the earth, when it was young, and a human woman from her tribe. Such unions were rare and often tragic, producing children who belonged fully to neither world. Her father loved her with a fierce, primal devotion, but his protection had become a prison. She had fled not because she didn't love him, but because she needed to find her own path, to discover if she could live among her mother's people without being overshadowed by her father's terrible presence. But there was more to the story, darker threads that the girl hesitated to reveal. The leather pouch around her neck contained something sacred, something that her father desperately needed. She had taken it not out of malice, but out of necessity, though the reasons remained unclear to Jack. Without it, her father would continue his rampage through the territories, and innocent people would die. Jack sat back against the rock wall, his mind reeling from everything he'd witnessed and learned. He'd saved a child from death, only to discover that she was the daughter of a living myth. And now, whether he wanted it or not, he was caught up in something far beyond a simple rescue. The girl needed to return to her people in the north, but they couldn't travel with her injury. And somewhere out there, an enraged giant was searching for his daughter, leaving destruction in his wake. As the morning wore on, Jack Morrison realized that the lonely, simple life he'd been living had just become impossibly complicated, and that the choices he made in the coming days would have consequences that rippled far beyond his own survival. 3 days passed in their hidden alcove, and during that time, Jack learned more about the hidden world that existed alongside the one he'd always known. Aida's grasp of English improved rapidly, far more rapidly than should have been possible, and Jack began to suspect that her heritage gave her abilities beyond those of ordinary humans. She could sense things in the wind and the earth, could read meanings in the movements of birds and the patterns of clouds that he could barely perceive. She told him stories of the ancient ones, the beings who had existed long before humans spread across the continent. They were creatures of earth and stone, of wind and water, born from the land itself and intimately connected to it. Most had withdrawn into the deep places of the world as humanity expanded, but a few remained, living in the remote mountains and hidden valleys where their old power still held sway. Her father, whose name translated roughly as Stone That Walks, was one of the last of his kind. He had loved Aida's mother with a devotion that transcended the boundaries between their peoples. And when she died giving birth to their daughter, something in him had broken. He became obsessively protective of Aida, forbidding her from leaving their mountain home, from interacting with humans, from experiencing any life beyond his watchful gaze. The leather pouch contained a stone apiece of the first mountain. She called it. That was the source of her father's power and his connection to the earth. Without it, he would eventually fade, becoming nothing more than another rock formation in the landscape. She had taken it not to kill him, but to force him to let her go, to accept that she needed to live her own life, even if it meant living without his protection. Jack understood the impulse, even if the scale was beyond anything he'd experienced. He'd lost his own family young, and had spent his life running from the emptiness they'd left behind. In a way, both he and the giant were prisoners of their grief, unable to move forward, unable to let go. On the fourth morning, as Jack was preparing to move their camp to a more defensible position, something extraordinary happened. Aida's leg, which should have taken weeks to heal, had mended almost completely. The swelling was gone, and when she stood with Jack's help, she could put weight on it with only minimal discomfort. She smiled at his amazement and explained that her mixed blood gave her certain advantages: accelerated healing, enhanced senses, and a natural affinity for the wilderness. It also meant that she would live far longer than any normal human, watching generations pass while barely aging herself. It was another reason her father's protectiveness had become unbearable. He was willing to wait decades or even centuries for her to grow up, not understanding that she needed to live, not just exist. They prepared to travel north toward her people's territory, but as they packed their meager supplies, the earth began to tremble again. This time, the vibrations came from a different direction, from the south, and they carried a different quality, more urgent and purposeful. Jack and Aida climbed to a high point overlooking the canyon and watched as Stone That Walks emerged from a distant valley, moving faster than before. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, perhaps a mile back, came a group of perhaps 20 armed men on horseback, keeping their distance but clearly tracking the giant. Jack recognized their type immediately: bounty hunters and adventure seekers, the kind of men who would chase legends for glory or profit. The fools were shooting at the giant, their rifles cracking uselessly against his stone hide. The bullets did no more damage than raindrops, but they enraged him, and each roar he released caused the hunters to fall back momentarily before surging forward again, emboldened by alcohol or stupidity. Aida clutched Jack's arm, her face pale with horror. "They'll drive him mad," she whispered. "He's already desperate to find me, and now they're tormenting him. If he goes truly berserk, he'll destroy everything in his path settlements, towns, everyone. The old ones have rules, restraints built into their nature, but push them too far, and those restraints break." Jack watched the scene unfold with growing dread. The giant was heading roughly in their direction, following whatever trail he'd picked up, and the hunters were herding him like dogs harrying a bear. If Stone That Walks reached their position while in this state, there would be no reasoning with him, no peaceful resolution. Then things got worse. One of the hunters, more skilled or lucky than the others, managed to throw a bundle of dynamite that exploded against the giant's leg. The blast didn't seriously injure him, but it enraged him beyond measure. He turned on his tormentors with a roar that could be heard for miles. raising his massive staff and bringing it down with earth-shattering force. The impact created a shockwave that threw horses and men through the air like toys. 3 of the hunters didn't get up. The others scattered, finally understanding the magnitude of their mistake. But the giant pursued them with single-minded fury, no longer searching for his daughter, but focused entirely on destroying those who had dared to harm him. Jack made a decision in that moment, one that surprised even himself. He turned to Aida and spoke with quiet intensity. "We can't let this continue. Those men are idiots, but they don't deserve to die. And your father doesn't deserve to become a monster. You said that stone is his power. What happens if we give it back?" Aida's eyes widened. "He'll calm, but he'll also regain his full strength. He could force me to return with him, could imprison me in the mountain forever. Maybe," Jack said, checking his rifle. "Or maybe seeing you alive and well, seeing that you survived without him, will make him understand. It's a gamble, but it's better than watching him slaughter those hunters and then level every town between here and the coast." The girl stared at him for a long moment, then slowly removed a leather pouch from around her neck. The moment it left her body, she seemed to diminish slightly, becoming more fully human and less something other. She placed it in Jack's weathered hand, and he felt the weight of it, not the physical weight, which was negligible, but the metaphysical weight of eons and power and ancient responsibility. "Then we ride," Jack said, heading for his horse. "And we better pray we reach him before the bloodshed gets worse." They rode hard across the Badlands, Aida mounted behind Jack, her arms wrapped around his waist as his horse stretched into a gallop that would have been punishing under normal circumstances. But necessity drove them forward, and the continued tremors and distant roars that echoed across the landscape told them they were racing against catastrophe. As they rode, Jack felt the weight of the stone in his saddlebag like a burning brand, as if it recognized that it was being carried away from its proper keeper. The air around them seemed to thicken with each mile, and he began to see things at the edges of his vision, shadows that moved against the wind shapes in the rocks that resembled watching faces, flickers of light that had no source. Aida sensed it too. "The land knows," she said, her voice barely audible over the thunder of hoofbeats. "It knows the stone is moving, that the balance is shifting. We're traveling between worlds now, Jack Morrison. The veil is thin here, and we walk where few mortals have walked before." They crested a rise and saw the scene of devastation spread before them. Stone That Walks stood in the center of a small valley, surrounded by the wreckage of the hunters' camp. Wagons had been reduced to splinters, and the ground was cratered from the impacts of his massive fists. The surviving hunters had taken refuge behind a formation of boulders, still occasionally firing their useless weapons in defiant desperation. But what froze Jack's blood was the giant's appearance. When he'd seen Stone That Walks before, the creature had possessed a certain nobility, a primordial majesty that commanded respect even through terror. Now, driven to the edge of madness by pain, rage, and desperate worry for his daughter, the giant had become something else, a force of pure destruction. His stone features twisted into a mask of fury, his eyes glowing with an inner fire that spoke of violence without reason. Jack dismounted a safe distance away and helped Aida down. She could barely stand, and he realized that being separated from the stone had weakened her more than she'd admitted. Her amber eyes had dulled to ordinary brown, and she moved like someone fighting through invisible weights. "I'll approach him," Jack said, checking his rifle one last time, not because he thought it would help against the giant, but because holding it gave him something to do with his hands. "You stay here, out of sight. If things go wrong, we both die," Aida interrupted, her voice weak but determined. "But they won't. He loves me, Jack. Beneath the rage and the madness, he loves me more than anything in this world or any other. That love is both his strength and his weakness." Jack nodded and began walking toward the giant, holding the leather pouch high above his head like a banner of parley. His boots crunched on broken stone and shattered wood as he crossed the devastated ground, each step taking him closer to the massive figure that dominated the landscape like a walking mountain. Stone That Walks noticed him when he was perhaps 50 yards away. The giant's head swiveled toward him with startling speed, and those burning eyes fixed on the tiny human approaching across the valley floor. Jack felt the weight of that gaze like a physical pressure, felt the ancient intelligence behind those eyes assessing him, judging him, deciding in a split second whether he was a threat to be crushed or something else entirely. Then the giant's eyes fell on the pouch in Jack's raised hand, and everything changed. The fury drained from Stone That Walks' features, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. He took a step toward Jack, and the cowboy had to fight every instinct that screamed at him to run. "I have your daughter," Jack called out, his voice somehow steady despite the terror singing through his veins. "She's alive and well. She asked me to return this to you, but only if you listen to what she has to say." The giant's mouth opened, and sounds emerged that might have been words in some ancient language that predated human speech. Then, with visible effort, those sounds shaped themselves into something approximating English, though the voice was like boulders grinding together, like the earth itself learning to speak. "Where is ... Aida?" Jack gestured behind him, and Aida stepped out from behind the rocks, limping but standing on her own. The moment Stone That Walks saw her, something profound happened. The giant dropped to his knees with an impact that created a small crater, bringing himself down to a level that was merely enormous rather than completely overwhelming. His massive hands reached toward her, then stopped, trembling, as if he was afraid that touching her would prove she was an illusion. Aida walked forward, moving past Jack with a small smile of gratitude, and stood before her father. Even kneeling, the giant towered over her, but there was no threat in his posture, now only desperate relief and a vulnerability that was heartbreaking to witness in. Something so powerful. Father and daughter began to speak in that ancient language, their voices rising and falling in patterns that seemed to echo the rhythms of wind and water, of stone and earth. Jack couldn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion in Aida explaining her need for freedom, for a life of her own choosing, and Stone That Walks trying to make her understand the dangers of the world beyond his protection, the fragility of human life, the pain of potentially losing the only thing he had left to love. The surviving hunters watched from their hiding place, weapons forgotten, witnessing something that would become legend in their own lifetimes, a conversation between a giant of the ancient world and his half-human daughter, negotiating the terms of love and freedom while a lone cowboy stood witness, holding the source of a god's power in his weathered hands. The conversation went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Jack saw actual tears of liquid stone rolling down the giant's craggy face. He saw Aida reach up to touch her father's massive hand, saw the giant cradle that small touch as if it were the most precious thing in existence. Finally, they seemed to reach some kind of understanding. Aida turned to Jack and gestured for him to approach. On unsteady legs, he walked forward and held out the leather pouch. Stone That Walks reached down with surprising gentleness, his enormous fingers delicately plucking the pouch from Jack's hand. The moment the stone returned to the giant's possession, a visible change swept through him. His skin seemed to firm, his eyes brightened, and the very air around him solidified with renewed power. But instead of using that power to reclaim his daughter by force, the giant did something unexpected. He opened the pouch and removed the stone, a piece of dark rock that glowed with inner light, and broke it in half with careful pressure. He handed one half to Aida and kept the other for himself, so that we're never truly separated, Aida translated for Jack, fresh tears streaming down her face. He'll always know where I am, and I'll always be able to find my way home. But he won't compel me to return. The choice will be mine. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded in ways Jack Morrison could never have anticipated. Stone that walks, his power partially restored but his fury completely spent, turned his attention to the destruction he'd caused. With movements that seemed almost ashamed, the giant began to repair what he could, setting broken trees upright in the earth, stacking scattered boulders into cairns that would serve as warnings and memorials, using his massive strength to create rather than destroy. The surviving hunters emerged cautiously from their shelter, weapons lowered but not abandoned, faces reflecting a mixture of terror, awe, and the 1,000-yard stare of men who had confronted something beyond their comprehension. Their leader, a grizzled man named Carson with a scar running the length of his face, approached Jack with visible effort at maintaining composure. "What in the name of all that's holy did we just witness?" Carson asked, his voice hoarse from screaming and dust. "We heard stories about a giant in these territories. Thought it was indigenous superstition or tall tales. We were tracking it for the bounty, maybe to capture it for some eastern showman. Never thought." He stopped, unable to continue. Jack looked at the man with something between pity and disgust. "You nearly started a war you couldn't possibly win. That being could have leveled every settlement between here and the Mississippi, and you pushed him toward it for money and glory." Aita stepped forward, her bearing transformed now that she held half of her father's power stone. She addressed the hunters in clear, commanding English that rang with authority beyond her apparent years. "Return to your people and tell them this. The Ancient Ones still walk these lands, and they demand respect. We have no quarrel with humans who honor the old ways and respect boundaries. But those who come seeking violence will find more than they bargain for. The treaty my father will offer today is the only one you'll receive." What followed was unlike anything Jack had ever experienced. Stone that walks, speaking through Aita as translator, established terms with the hunters that they would carry back to the settlements. Certain territories would be recognized as belonging to the Ancient Ones, sacred grounds where humans could pass through but not settle. In return, the giants and other old beings would withdraw further into the mountains, limiting their interactions with the expanding human world. It was a treaty born of necessity on both sides. The Ancient Ones recognized that humanity's numbers and technology would only grow, that the old world was giving way to the new, whether they liked it or not. And the humans, having faced the reality of what the old legends could do, understood that some boundaries were better left unbroken. As the hunters departed, humbled and forever changed, Stone that walks turned his attention to Jack. The giant regarded him with those ancient eyes, and Jack felt the weight of a judgment that transcended any human law or moral code. Through Aita, the giant spoke. "You saved my daughter when you had no reason to, no obligation. You could have left her to die, could have used her for ransom, could have sold her to those who collect curiosities. Instead, you offered mercy. For this, I owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "I did what anyone should do. No debt needed." "Exactly," Aida translated, a smile in her voice. "You did what anyone should do, but so few actually would. That's what makes it worthy of recognition." The giant reached down and touched the earth at Jack's feet. The ground glowed briefly, and when the light faded, a small stone had emerged, not the powerful artifact of the Ancient Ones, but something simpler. It was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with gentle energy. "A gift," Aita explained. "It will guide you to water in the desert, will make shelter appear when you need it most, will ensure that you never walk alone even in the emptiest places. It's a small thing by my father's standards, but for a human traveling the frontier, it's a significant blessing." Jack accepted the stone, feeling its warmth spread through his palm and up his arm, feeling something in his chest, some long frozen place where hope used to live begin to thaw. But Stone That Walks wasn't finished. The giant turned and began walking toward the northern mountains, each step covering vast distances. Then he paused and looked back, waiting. Aida took Jack's hand and began walking after her father, pulling the cowboy along. "Where are we going?" Jack asked, though part of him already knew. "To my people," Aita replied. "To the village in the high mountains where my mother's tribe has lived for generations. My father wants them to meet you, to hear the story of how you saved me." And she hesitated, then continued with a shy smile. "I want you to stay, at least for a while. You've been alone too long, Jack Morrison. You've been running from your grief for so many years that you've forgotten what it's like to have a place to belong." They traveled for 3 days, following stone that walks through territories that few outsiders had ever seen. The giant served as their guide and guardian, clearing paths through impossible terrain, bridging chasms with his massive strength, and ensuring that no danger animal or otherwise threatened their journey. As they climbed into the high mountains, Jack felt the air change, growing thinner and cleaner, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle. They passed through groves of ancient trees that seemed to whisper among themselves, crossed streams that ran with water so pure it seemed to glow, and walked through meadows filled with flowers that existed in no botanist's catalog. Finally, they reached Aita's village, a community built into the mountainside, where stone and wood blended so seamlessly it was hard to tell where nature ended and human construction began. The people emerged to greet them, showing no fear of the giant who had been both blessing and burden to their tribe for generations. They welcomed Jack with a warmth that surprised him, as if his rescue of Aita had earned him a place among them. That night, gathered around fires that burned with colors Jack had never seen, he heard Stone That Walks tell the story of his journey, not just the recent days, but the centuries before, when the world was younger and the boundaries between the ancient and the new were more easily crossed. It was a tale of love and loss, of adaptation and resistance, of trying to hold on to what was precious in a world that insisted on changing. Jack found himself telling his own story, in return words spilling out that he hadn't spoken in years, about his family lost to war, about the aimless wandering that followed, about the emptiness that had driven him further and further into lonely places. And for the first time, surrounded by people who understood loss and adaptation, who lived between two worlds themselves, he felt heard. 3 months passed, and Jack Morrison discovered something he'd thought lost forever, a reason to stay in one place. The mountain village became his home in ways that nowhere else ever had. He taught the children how to track and hunt using frontier techniques, while they taught him the old ways of reading the land through senses beyond the ordinary. He helped build and repair, learning to work with stone and wood in methods that honored both the material and the mountain that provided it. Aita thrived in her freedom, moving between her father's ancient world and her mother's human one with increasing confidence. She would spend weeks with the tribe, learning the healing arts and stories of her mother's lineage, then venture into the deep mountains to walk with Stone That Walks, maintaining the connection that bound them. The giant himself changed in subtle ways. The desperate fury that had driven him to destructive madness was replaced by something more measured. A cosword, a measured. A hasta, father learning to let go while still remaining present, a being of ancient power, accepting that the world had room for both his kind and humanity if boundaries were respected. But the peace was not without its challenges. News of the treaty with the giant spread through frontier settlements, and it drew attention, some welcome, much not. Scholars came seeking to study the ancient ones, soldiers came to assess potential threats, and opportunists came looking for ways to exploit what they saw as valuable resources. Through it all, Jack found himself serving as an unlikely ambassador. His status as the man who had helped broker peace between Stone That Walks and the hunters gave him credibility with both worlds. He traveled down from the mountains periodically, carrying messages and maintaining the fragile understanding that kept violence at bay. It was during one of these journeys that Jack encountered Major Thomas Grayson, a military officer tasked with evaluating the giant situation for the territorial government. Grayson was a practical man, more interested in maintaining order than seeking glory, and he listened carefully as Jack explained the reality of what lived in the mountains. "You're asking us to recognize sovereignty for beings that aren't human," Grayson said, not hostile but skeptical. "That's a precedent that will have consequences far beyond these mountains." "I'm asking you to recognize reality," Jack replied. "Those beings were here first. They have power you can't match with all your cavalry and artillery. And most importantly, they're willing to coexist peacefully if humans respect their boundaries. The alternative is a war that would devastate both sides and solve nothing." The Major studied him for a long moment. "You've changed, Morrison. When I last heard of you, you were a drifter with no ties and no cause. Now you speak like a man with something worth fighting for." Jack considered this and nodded slowly. "Maybe I found something worth staying for. Or maybe it found me." The negotiations that followed took weeks. Jack brought tribal elders down from the mountains, and to everyone's astonishment, Stone That Walks himself appeared at one carefully orchestrated meeting. Though he remained at a distance, his mere presence a reminder of what was at stake. The treaty that emerged was imperfect but functional. Designated territories would be protected. Sacred sites would remain undisturbed, and in return, the Ancient Ones would refrain from interfering with human expansion in other areas. It wasn't a perfect solution, such things never were, but it was a beginning. A recognition that the world was large enough for multiple ways of being, if people chose understanding over fear. As spring turned to summer, Jack found himself standing on a high ridge with Aita, watching the sun set over the territories they'd fought to protect. She had grown in the months since he'd found her in that ravine, not in physical stature, but in confidence and purpose. She moved between worlds with a grace that came from accepting both halves of her heritage, no longer torn but strengthened by her dual nature. "What will you do now?" she asked him. "You've helped establish the peace, proved that a human and the Ancient Ones can work together. You could return to the frontier, to the life you knew before." Jack was quiet for a long moment, watching the play of light across the mountains. "I've spent years running from ghosts," he finally said. "Running from the people I lost, from the life I thought I'd have. But I've learned something here. You can't outrun grief, but you can choose what you do with it. You can let it hollow you out, or you can let it carve space for something new." He turned to look at Aida, this remarkable young woman who was both human and something more, who had shown him that courage meant accepting vulnerability as much as facing danger. "I think I'll stay, if your people will have me. There's work to be done here, maintaining the balance, helping others understand what I've learned. And," he paused, a slight smile crossing his weathered face, "I've finally found a place where I don't feel like a ghost. Myself." Aita's answering smile was radiant. "My father will be pleased. He's grown fond of you, though he'd never admit it in those words. He says you have the patience of stone and the adaptability of water-high praise from one of the Ancient Ones." As they walked back toward the village, the stars beginning to emerge overhead, Jack reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. A simple act of mercy rescuing a fallen girl from a ravine had led to encounters with living legends, had challenged everything he thought he knew about the world, and had ultimately given him back something he thought he'd lost forever: a sense of purpose and belonging. The village came into view, lights flickering in windows carved into the mountainside, smoke rising from cooking fires where families gathered for the evening meal. Jack could hear laughter and conversation, could see children playing in the last light of day, could sense the rhythms of a community that had learned to thrive in the spaces between two worlds. Stone That Walks stood at the edge of the village, a massive silhouette against the darkening sky, watching over his daughter's adopted home as he had for generations. He raised one enormous hand in greeting as Jack and Aita approached a gesture that had become familiar over the months: acknowledgement, respect, and something that might have been friendship translated across the vast differences between a mortal man and an ancient being of living stone. That night, gathered around the central fire with the tribe, Jack told the story again, how he'd found Aida, how they'd returned the Power Stone, how they'd helped forge a peace that might last generations. But this time, he added a new ending, one that was still being written. He spoke about the responsibility that came with understanding, about the need to build bridges between worlds that had grown too separate, about the possibility that differences could be strengths rather than sources of conflict. He talked about the importance of seeing the humanity in the other, even when that other was a being of myth and legend or a culture different from your own. The tribal elders nodded their approval, recognizing wisdom hard-won through experience. The children listened with wide eyes, understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves, inheritors of a legacy that stretched back to the dawn of time and forward into an uncertain future. As the fire burned low and people began to drift toward their homes, Aida placed her hand on Jack's shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For saving me that day, yes. But more than that, for seeing me as more than just the giant's daughter or the half-blood caught between worlds. For treating me as simply Aida, a person worthy of respect and capable of choosing her own path." Jack covered her hand with his own, feeling the subtle thrum of ancient power that ran through her veins, but also the simple warmth of human connection. "You saved me too," he replied. "Maybe more than you know. You reminded me that it's never too late to find your place in the world, to become part of something greater than your own story." In the months and years that followed, Jack Morrison became a legend in his own right, the cowboy who walked with giants. Some called him, or the bridge builder, or simply the peacekeeper. He never sought such titles, but they came anyway, because people needed stories of how different worlds could meet without destroying each other, how understanding could triumph over fear. He grew old in that mountain village, his hair turning white and his face becoming as weathered as the rocks around him. Aida remained young, her mixed heritage granting her a lifespan that would see centuries pass. But she never forgot the lonely cowboy who had chosen mercy over indifference, who had risked everything to reunite a daughter with her father. And Stone That Walks, the giant of living stone, stood watch over them all, a reminder that some things endure beyond the span of human years, that love and loyalty can transcend the boundaries between worlds, and that even the mightiest beings can learn and change and grow. The treaty held, not perfectly, but well enough. There were tensions and occasional violations, misunderstandings and conflicts that required negotiation and compromise. But the foundation remained solid, built on a simple act of kindness in a lonely canyon, where a drifter had stopped to help a fallen girl, and had discovered that mercy was never wasted, that courage took many forms, and that the most important journeys often began with the smallest choice. Jack Morrison had spent most of his life running from connection, afraid that opening himself to others would only lead to more loss and pain. But in the end, he learned what Aida and her father already knew, that isolation was its own kind of death. That meaning came from the bonds we forge and the responsibilities we accept. And that home wasn't a place you found, but a choice you made every single day to belong to something larger than yourself. As he sat on his porch in the twilight years of his life, watching the sun set over mountains that held mysteries older than human memory, Jack often thought about that day in the ravine, about the split-second decision that had changed everything. He thought about all the times he could have walked away, could have chosen the easier path, could have remained alone and untouched by the complications of caring. And every time he gave thanks that he hadn't, because in saving one lost girl, he had found himself. And in the process, he had helped weave a story that would be told around fires for generations. A story about giants and cowboys, about fathers and daughters, about the courage to change and the wisdom to understand that different didn't mean dangerous, that other didn't mean enemy, and that the bridges between worlds were built one act of kindness at a time. The giant's daughter had become a leader among her people, guiding them through the changes that swept across the territories as the frontier era gave way to something new. And the lonely cowboy had become a grandfather to a village, his stories and wisdom passed down to children who would carry them forward into a future where humans and the ancient ones might truly learn to share the world. It was, Jack reflected, a better ending than he'd ever imagined for himself. Better than dying alone in some forgotten canyon. Better than wandering endlessly with no purpose or connection. He had found his place in the story, had written himself into a legend that would outlast his mortal years. And on still nights when the wind whispered through the pines and the stars burned bright overhead, he could hear stone that walks moving through the high peaks, keeping watch as he had for countless centuries, singing songs in a language older than human memory, songs of stone and earth, of endurance and change, of love that transcended understanding, and of the strange and wonderful ways that lives could intersect and transform each other in the vast, mysterious tapestry of existence.